thanks very much for
That's all right.
coming to have a chat.
It's my pleasure.
Just for our audience, we'd probably better say who we are. I'm Roger Charlton from Nottingham University.
I'm Ryan Prince. I work for the GP National Recruitment Office, and I'm involved in situational judgment test writing for entry to GP training.
Excellent, and that's really what I want to talk to you about, is situational judgment questions. Tell me in your capacity what you would write a situational judgment question for, or what you understand by a situational judgment question.
We, in the year 2000, the people who were devising the new sort of entry to GP training thought of the core competencies we wanted trainees to have, and they worked out that we wanted them to have 4 or 5 specific competencies at the entry to training and 12 competencies at the exit of training. So we thought at the entry to training we'd assess specifically at situational judgment 4 competencies, and those would be coping with pressure, professional integrity, empathy and sensitivity, and communication skills. So our situational judgment tests are broken down into those 4 areas, and that's what we test. And we write 2 different types of questions to do that for us.
Well, we're really keen to learn from you, because we're hoping to apply situational judgment questions to Year 1 and specifically Year 2 students at Nottingham Medical School. And this relates to a course called ECPD, which is Early Clinical and Professional Development, where we hope that the students will be gaining an understanding of what's meant by medical professionalism, but also to be able to apply the 4 principles of medical ethics to clinical scenarios. An example might be something to do with mental capacity, an elderly person who's maybe developing beginnings of dementia.
Right.
So you mentioned professional integrity, and it sounds like that would be something that we'd be...
Yes, it sounds like there'd be a particular overlap between your testing of ethics and our professional integrity. So that's obviously what you're going to be sticking to. And from our earlier conversation, it appears that students would be expected to have a knowledge of mental capacity and the medical ethics principles, so you can incorporate that prior knowledge into your testing, and that's absolutely fine in that case.
Yeah, and for instance, in situations like an under 16-year-old coming in to consult wanting the oral contraceptive pill, we'd expect them to understand what's meant by Gillick competency and also Fraser guidelines.
Of course.
And they have a series of seminars and lectures where they work through such scenarios and have an opportunity to be able to apply the 4 principles of medical ethics. Just thinking of the situational judgment questions, I understand there are 2 types of questions.
There are 2 main types that we use, and that is a ranking question where there are 5 possible answers to a dilemma, and they as standalone options will solve the problem to a greater or lesser extent. The other type is choosing 3 correct responses to 8 potential responses, and those 3 things should solve the problem together. But the other responses or distractors should be able to be combined with some of the correct answers, otherwise you get this mutually exclusive problem, which we can talk about later if you like.
So why would you choose one type of question over the other type that you've mentioned?
Well, kind of as I said, if there's an ethical dilemma which needs several things to be done to solve it, so for example, if you need to speak to somebody's mother and involve social services and do something else to really solve the problem as a whole, that would be one where you'd actually use choosing 3 from 8 potential answers. But what you have to do before you even start writing your SJTs is really make a note of what knowledge you'd expect them to have before they actually come into the test. Because it's no good asking them to call medical defence unions and speak to the CCG lead if they're not really expected to know that. So it's very clear. It's very important when you approach this, really, to have a very clear understanding of what they should know before, so that when you write your answers you don't trip them up.
Now we're going to be using these questions to actually assess the students instead of using a written assessment. And I'm getting the impression with ranking and rating that we may need the help of somebody with a lot of statistical knowledge? Is that?
It is. Yeah. The problem is with writing situational judgment questions is when you write them, it's better to write them as a group anyway and have your peers review them to see if they to try and agree the key. And the key in our language is the correct answers in which order. So, excuse me. The more people you get to have a look, and the more people you get to work out what the keys should be, the more accurate they actually are. But you never actually know how well they perform until they're piloted, and then you really need a very good statistician to have a look at how they perform. And as I'm sure you're aware, you look at the best students and how they do, and the worst students and how they do, and see if you can tell if they're performing via that mechanism. But you need quite a lot of support to do it. And we use a group called Work Psychology Group in London who are very good at doing this.
So in relation to writing a question and peer reviewing it, how long, just with one question, would you say it takes to get that question almost as good as you can?
It probably takes about 9 months with us, to be honest. It's first written and then reviewed by a small local group. Then it goes away to a national conference for a few days where other people look at it. Then it goes to our Work Psychology Group colleagues who send it back with amendments after they've piloted it. Yeah. So we actually get graphs of how it performs. So it takes a very, very long time to work a question up to performance standard. And I'd say probably what you're looking for when you write a situational judgment test question is a rate of performance of between 50 and 60% of your questions. So regrettably, we end up losing 40 to 50% of our questions. They just don't work.
So when you say a rate of performance, tell me.
What I mean by that really is that they do what they're meant to do, that the good students get them right and the bad students get them wrong.
Oh, so it's a good discriminator.
It's a very good discriminator. Now sometimes what you can actually do is if the very good students disagree with your answer key but come up with a candidate key, you can actually change the question answer to the candidate key. So if your very, very good students disagreed with the way you put it, it might be that they were right and we were wrong as an item writing group. So you can go with the candidate key and it can still perform very well. So sometimes just minor alterations in the way it's scored will do it. But that's for your statisticians really.
Now you used a phrase about key. I'm just wondering if you could tell me what we should understand by the stem,
of course,
the key and the distractors.
Okay, well in MCQ writing terms, the stem of the question is the question itself, and the rules about writing a stem is there should be absolutely nothing ambiguous or distracting in the question itself in the stem. It should be short and concise. If you have a stem that says Mrs. J is a 16-year-old Muslim lady, then it should be relevant that she's married, that she's 15 and that she's Muslim and that she's a lady. And if none of that information is actually relevant, then leave it out. So everything in the stem should be there because it's relevant to the question you're going to ask. So that there are no trip-ups in the stem, otherwise it doesn't perform very well. The key is what we actually refer to as the correct answer. Okay. So if we have an A, B, C, D, E MCQ and the key was A, that is the correct option. And the distractors are everything that are meant to distract the poorer candidate from the key. And distractors should always be plausible or they don't perform. So when we statistically analyse, if we see a distractor that nobody has gone for, we won't use it again and we'll change the distractor. So what you really want is when you build a distractor is to have 1 or 2 killer distractors that the poor candidates will go for. And even one will do the job sometimes.
So as you say, those distractors need to be plausible.
They do. And some of the distractors I find the very best when we write are things like if a colleague of yours is in difficulty and one of the distractors is go straight to the general medical counsel about them, because of patient safety. The poorer candidates may well go for that distractor thinking of patient safety but not really think they should try and sort things out themselves first. So those tend to be quite good distractors and running and telling another body. So you can quite discriminate against, ethically you can discriminate against poor candidates quite well with those sorts of distractors.
And in relation to the responses, are there any issues relating to, the language used? Do we need to be careful about acronyms? It's
best, if possible, not to use acronyms at all, for obvious reasons. I mean, candidates do complain these days that they didn't understand what something meant, so to avoid any problems, I wouldn't use any acronyms. the stem should always be clear and concise, and we say no more than 80 words, because if it gets much more than 80 words, it gets a bit cumbersome.
Right.
People have to read and reread it.
Yeah.
The answers and distractors themselves should be clear and concise and not too wordy. Sometimes a very, very wordy response in one of the options actually keys the correct answer, because there's a lot to it. So they should be roughly the same size if you can. The other thing that's very, very important with the answers and the distractors is not to give a reason. So you wouldn't ever say, tell the nurse to do something because of some reason, because you're actually giving the candidate the reason to do it. You can say, tell the nurse to do something to achieve an action. That's absolutely fine, if you just to make it clear what action you're trying to do.
So it sounds like the word because
is not very good in the actual distractor. Or
are there any other words that we should avoid that you
not. I don't think so. The other thing you've got to be quite careful of with all of these type of questions when you're writing them is the dichotomous response, which is either yes or no.
Right.
So if there's a scenario, say, where you are a medical student and another medical student asks you to forge a signature on a very minor report for you so you don't get in trouble, that really is a, well, yes, I'm going to do it, or no, I'm not going to do it response. And no matter how you try to dress it up with other things, in the end it's just yes or no, and those questions tend to fail really. So if it's a dichotomous yes or no, try and build something more into it really, or they don't work very well from our experience.
Okay, well that's been very helpful. I understand there is quite a body of knowledge that backs up the sort of reliability and validity of situational judgment questions, but particularly in the postgraduate setting.
Well, in the postgraduate setting, the situational judgment test at it's the penultimate stage of entry to general practice. The ultimate stage now is simulated patient test, but the correlation between pass rates of the MRCGP exam is most aligned to our situational judgment test. So people who do well in our SJTs, as we call them, go on to pass the MRCGP. So they're a very, very powerful tool and being used more and more in all sectors now, as you know, in the undergraduate sector for entry to med schools and from what you're doing. So they're incredibly powerful. And I think you can justify using them rather than essay writing. So. And
I understand other colleges are thinking of using
them.
They
are, yes. I'd like to say the RCGP, the general practitioners, they're quite well ahead of other colleges. We've been developing these for a long time now. So I think they're a very powerful tool, and it's excellent you're going to be using them at Nottingham.
Well, thank you very much. This is going to give a lot of guidance to our team to be able to help write these questions. I don't know whether you'd be happy maybe just at the beginning if we did send you one or two questions just to have a look at them.
I'd be delighted to have a look at a few questions, give you some tips on whether they're likely to perform or not. The problem is you never know until they're piloted, but sometimes you can tell that there's a lot of pitfalls in this question. The real key is to have as many people as you can actually look at your questions, because they'll pick the problems out of it. So peer review before they're tested really is of great importance.
And as you say, involve your person with statistical knowledge at an early stage.
Absolutely, but I think outside statistical analysis is vital here, or they just you don't know whether they perform or not. So
great, well,
that's helpful.
Thank you very much. That's really good. Thank you.
Send me some questions and I'll have a look at them.
We very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
That's a pleasure. No problem at all.